took her out in the boat to go fishing, and she was going to drown me out there, so I had to marry her.
I was born on a little horse ranch just outside of Billings, Montana, to August and Ellen Plate. It was August 21st, 1920, the beginning of the Roaring Twenties. When I was 6 weeks old, my parents separated. I never saw my father again. My mother and I moved to Watertown, South Dakota, where my grandparents were living. I was an only child and my mother worked, so I spent much of my childhood living with my grandparents. My mother was the middle of 3 daughters, who by now were all grown. Because my grandparents didn't have any sons, they wanted to adopt me to carry on the Eddie name, but my mother refused. My mother eventually married Ted Stibe, but I still spent much of my time living with my grandparents and playing with cousins. The Roaring Twenties gave way to the Depression years of the 1930s. These were tough times for everyone, and my parents moved to Minneapolis with me to work for a few years. When their jobs closed down in Minneapolis, we moved to California because they had heard that there was work out there. By the late 1930s, we again moved back to Minneapolis. Times continued to be tough, so on December 27, 1939, I went into the Navy and I was sent to Great Lakes Naval Station for boot camp. After boot camp, I spent about 2 years on the USS Boise, and then I was temporarily transferred to Wake Island just before war had broken out in the Pacific. Wake Island was attacked by the Japanese within hours of their attack on Pearl Harbor on December 22, 1941. After 16 days of fighting, I was taken as a prisoner of war for close to 4 years. I was in a Japanese prison camp not too far from Nagasaki when the atomic bomb went off on August 9, 1945 at 11 o'clock in the morning. Near the end of the war, my parents purchased the Aiken Lake Resort in northern Minnesota, where I later spent 4 years recuperating after the war had ended. In 1947, while still recuperating at the resort, I met a sweet young lady who caught my eye, Darladean Plate.
I was born on April 8, 1931, to Lloyd and Violet D. Hart. I had 3 older brothers. When my father learned he had a baby girl, he was so excited he jumped over a fence to spread the news. Like Bill, I was raised in Watertown, South Dakota, but I was born during the midst of the Great Depression. At 60 cents a day wages, my parents struggled to feed and clothe their family. My dad worked at Swift's premium meatpacking plant until 1938, when we followed his dream to farm and moved to Sabina, Minnesota. The farmer let us stay there rent-free as long as Dad would farm the land. Despite all his efforts, the crops failed because of drought, and we moved farther north to Raby, Minnesota, about 20 miles from Grand Rapids. Through lots of hard work, they were able to make a living on this remote farm. My oldest brother Wayne joined the Army and spent most of World War II fighting in Europe. One evening in 1947, Dad and Wayne came home from Grand Rapids with 2 men whom they invited to supper. Dad and Wayne had stopped at Swanson's Chevrolet dealer for some automobile parts, and while they were waiting, 2 other men walked in because they were having car troubles. Wayne said to Dad, "Now there's a guy who had a tough time in the war." When Dad looked in their direction, the older of the 2 caught his attention. After a moment, Dad said, "Hey, Ted?" The man recognized Dad right away. The 2 men were Ted Stibe and his stepson, Bill Plate. Dad and Ted had worked together for 10 years at Swift's premium meatpacking plant in Watertown. Dad invited them out to our farm for supper that night, and found out that Ted and Bill ran a fishing resort about 50 miles past our farm. I was 16 at the time, and I didn't take particular notice of either men. I moved into Grand Rapids when I was 17 and began working in the hospital laundry and later as a nurse's aide. My parents and Ted, Ellen, and Bill continued their friendships and visits, but I only saw them a few times. I seldom got to go home on my days off, but one weekend in April 1949 I was home when Ted, Ellen, and Bill came to visit. It was probably the first time I really even noticed him. A few days later, Bill drove into Grand Rapids and took me to a movie. It was a horrible science fiction movie called When Worlds Collide. Over the next few weeks, we had a couple of picnics, visited Tame Fish Lake, went swimming and boating.
This Deanie girl had just turned 18 and she was turning my head. One day I took Deanie boating at Aiken Lake and we had a picnic lunch out on the island. I asked her to be my wife and she accepted. Afterwards, I told everyone that I had to ask her to marry me because she threatened to drown me if I didn't. Have you ever heard of a Navy man that couldn't swim?
We were married at my parents' home on July 6, 1949. Our parents couldn't have been more pleased, and their friendship lasted throughout their lives.
We spent our honeymoon on a new cabin that I had built on the resort. Before the end of July, my parents said we'd have to move on because the resort wasn't big enough to support 2 families, so I found a job in Minneapolis laying bricks.
I just assumed we'd live at the resort, and I think Bill did too. We lived in Minneapolis until Thanksgiving when Bill's work ended for the winter. With no other place to go, we moved in with my parents, where we spent the winter and spring. Our first child was born on May 23rd. The farm roads were so muddy that Bill got stuck, and my dad even got the tractor stuck trying to get us out to the highway. Eventually, we made it to the hospital, and in time.
We tried to buy some land in the Split Hand Lake area, but we didn't have any money.
By spring, I was really itching to get out on our own, and when I heard about work on the farms in North Dakota, I jumped at the opportunity. The work was hard, and I put in long hours. What worried me the most was that Deanie and our new baby Dale were stuck all day alone in a 12 by 18 cabin with no way to stay cool or even see me during the daylight hours. When the farm work was done, we moved back to Grand Rapids, where Wayne and I made cement blocks all day for Frederick Mills Lumber Company. We must have worked hard because it wasn't long before we were in charge of the cement shop.
Around May of 1951, Bill got a job working at the iron ore mines. It was a good job, and he eventually worked up to a steam shovel operator. I was so proud to see him operating the huge equipment. We bought a small one-bedroom house in Bovey. It was so small that the toilet was in the closet, but it was ours. Our second child, Vicky, a baby girl, was born September 5th, 1951. About 2 years later, we were surprised with twin boys on July 2nd, 1953. We named the twins Ronald and Richard, and boy was I busy taking care of newborn twin boys, a 2-year-old girl, and a 3-year-old boy. My sister Juanita volunteered to watch the kids, and for 10 days, Bill and I took a vacation to the Black Hills, the farthest I'd ever traveled from home before.
With the house busting at the seams, we moved into temporary housing in a small trailer house while our new home was being built on Pokegama Lake. In July of 1956, we moved to our new house with 2 bedrooms and its own bathroom. It wasn't large, but it was much better than our small cottage in Bovey. Living on a lake was a great place to be, and we all spent many hours playing in the water. Labor strikes at the iron mines usually meant that I was unemployed at least part of the year. In April 1957, I was offered a clerk position at the post office, which I accepted. The pay was much less, but it was full-time work.
By the time 1960 rolled around, everyone was excitedly planning a big trip to California. Just imagine seeing deserts and mountains and the ocean for the first time and going to Disneyland. We had to camp out nearly every night, carry all our gear with us, and cook our own meals. But it was a wonderful trip. Ronnie and Ricky were nearly 7 years old enough to be helpers and remember the trip. The kids were growing, and having 4 kids in one bedroom was tough, especially for Vicky. So we again packed up and moved, this time to an 80-acre farm in the Split Hand Lake area. We didn't get to spend as much time in the water, but the kids learned how to care for animals, do chores, drive tractors, and put up hay. The house wasn't much. In fact, it was just a basement without any interior walls, running water but no drains. We had a lot of trees and no close neighbors.
We got right to work clearing more land for the pastures, which Deanie and Dale were the primary workers. We also cut down some of the many pine, oak, maple, and ash trees for lumber. When the wood was dry enough, we had them sawn into boards and planed. As soon as our lumber was ready, we began building the upstairs. It was a fun project, and we had lots of help from our family and friends. The boys were active in wrestling, and Vicky in cheerleading. A special time in our lives came about on February 8, 1967, when we adopted 13-month-old Becky. She was 12 and a half years younger than the twins, but she fit in well and adjusted quickly. Deanie's parents moved to Alaska and we felt sort of at loose ends, so we sold out and moved to Colorado in 1968, where I worked for the post office.
There were a lot of interesting things to see and do, but it just never felt like home.
After working for the post office in Colorado for 5 years, I was able to retire. We all wanted to move to Alaska, where by this time Deanie's parents and two brothers, Calvin and Wayne, were living. We all sorely missed being close to the relatives, so at the end of May 1973, we left Colorado and began our trek to Alaska. We were blessed with good weather and only had a few minor mechanical problems. When Deanie's family had heard we were coming, they packed their camper and met us partway down the Alaska Highway. It was a joyous reunion. We felt like we were going home.
We've had many wonderful times in Alaska, too numerous to count. There have been some setbacks, disappointments, injuries, sickness, and even the loss of loved ones. But this is the place where I want to be. Most of my kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids are here.
We have all been able to do things in Alaska that we had never expected to do. Hunting, fishing, going out on the ocean, flying airplanes, and much more.
It's been an adventurous life together. We've traveled and in more things than I ever imagined that we would do. Bill has been a good husband and provider. I've been truly blessed.
God has truly blessed us and our family. Being an only child, I missed out on the family life until I got married. My wife of 6 years has given me many joys and a wonderful family.